Hi, and welcome to the Padded Room. I'll talk a bit more about this space at the end of the video. I'm Scott Anderson, known musically as Room 34, and I usually don't speak in my videos, which is probably for the best. And I'm reading from a script here, which is not ideal, but I have a lot to cover, and I don't want to miss any of the key points. Today I'm going to talk about my recent recording of the Pat Metheny Group tune Minuano 6/8, kind of a director's commentary track. We'll be watching the video and listening to the song in the background, but if you want to hear it without my blather, a link to the original video is in the description. I also have a bunch of other music videos you might enjoy on this channel and with my band 32nd Street Jazz. Hit the subscribe button to get notified when I post a new one. Okay, let's get started. Minuano was originally released in 1987 on the Pat Metheny Group's Geffen Records debut album, Still Life Talking. This was a big leap for the band because Geffen allowed them to actually take their time in the studio to develop something bigger than a typical jazz record. Pat Metheny produced some great music in his time on ECM Records, but he said the projects always felt rushed. ECM took a very old-school approach to recording jazz albums, knocked the whole thing out in a day or two, few or no overdubs, and not much time to really explore what could be done with studio technology. So when he signed to Geffen, it was a liberating experience. He produced what I think is his best album as a result. But maybe I'm just biased because Still Life Talking was my introduction to Pat Metheny. When I joined my high school jazz band in the early 90s, we played It's Just Talk, another track from the album, and I was so enthralled with it that I went right out and bought the CD. It was one of only about 5 jazz albums I had ever heard before I went to college. Minuano has long been my favorite track on the album. There's just something amazingly uplifting about it. It has an almost spiritual quality, and it's helped me through some tough times in life. So I've always wanted to learn more about it and see what I could do with it, but it's taken me 30 years to get there. Let's check it out. About a year ago, I decided I wanted to buy an EWI, specifically the EWI USB. It was the most inexpensive way to get into the EWI, which I'd also been interested in since high school when I saw Michael Brecker playing an early model. I made up my mind last year to buy one, but they were out of stock everywhere for months. When they finally did come in, I hesitated, because in the meantime I had read some negative reviews, specifically of the USB model. But finally last month I went for it, and I was pleasantly surprised. It's both easier and more challenging to play than I'd expected. Akai's software is their weak point, and the EWI configuration app doesn't work at all on my M1 Mac. Fortunately, the default settings work fine. EWI fingering is very close to saxophone, so there was almost no learning curve. But the tricky thing is, the EWI has no moving parts. The keys are capacitive touch sensors, which means you can't rest your fingers on them. If you touch them at all, you're fingering a note. For most of the keys, it's not a problem, but the 2 B-flat keys, the side right index finger key, and the U-shaped bis key, sometimes catch me off guard. By the way, yes, it's a ukulele bass, a fretless ukulele bass. It has silicone strings. It's very weird to play. It's advertised as sounding just like an upright bass, which I think is overselling it a bit, but it has its charms. Musically, I love this opening section. The Minuano is a cold wind that blows in south of Brazil. Pat Metheny was heavily inspired by Brazilian music for this album, and this title is very evocative. The music sounds like a mysterious wind. The original version featured wordless vocals, but I decided to put the lead line on the EWI. I was originally going to go with an alto flute sound, but when I tried the flugelhorn with a bit of chorus added, I knew immediately it was perfect. Under the lead, there's this syncopated line originally played on an acoustic guitar. I split the line between 3 EWI parts using a synth pad sound. The thing is, the syncopations are incredibly difficult to play, especially on a wind instrument. Not just because they're hard to count, but because they don't leave room to breathe. So I went in a different direction as a practical consideration, but also to play up the polyrhythms inherent in 6/8, which honestly I don't feel are fully represented in the original. It really feels more like it's in 3/4 to me. I recorded a few parts for this that I ended up scrapping and re-recording. One of those is the keyboard pad that appears the second time through the opening section. I decided to give it a bit of Rick Wakeman treatment and play 2 keyboards at once. It's not very flashy though, and I don't own a sequin cape. The main head of the tune is introduced with a distinct pop sound, possibly the old finger-in-the-cheek technique. But for my version, I decided on a close-up shot of the jam block and cowbell simultaneously. The mystery of the Minuano, to me, is captured by the wavering tonality throughout the song. Is it in A major or A minor? It seems to want to be both. The changes remind me of wind shifting directions. Here I have the melody played in octaves on the clarinet and Iwi flute. There was originally going to be a triple part on bass clarinet, 2 octaves below the clarinet, but I didn't really like how it sounded, so I scrapped it. I've been improvising solos for 30 years, and I still struggle to play the changes. Partly that's because, at least back in the early 90s, you didn't really learn the tools of improvisation or much about reading chord symbols and such in school jazz ensembles. You definitely learned style and technique through reading the charts, but once it got to the solos, you were kind of on your own. I played lead tenor sax, which meant I got a fair number of solos. I made do by figuring out a single scale that I thought worked over the entire set of changes. Usually that ended up being a blues scale or a pentatonic scale, which all makes perfect sense to me now, but I didn't have the vocabulary for it back then, beyond the minor blues scale, which was the only thing my high school band director explicitly taught us for soloing. I kind of chose to punish myself by soloing on clarinet and soprano sax on this. Both instruments are pitched in B flat, which means they read music a whole step higher than the concert pitch. So this song being A means for B flat instruments, it's actually in B. It's 5 sharps. Soloing over 5 sharps is interesting. I tried to follow the changes somewhat here, but in the end I determined that the first half of the A section worked well over an A concert major scale, and the rest worked well over a C major scale, with one notable exception. There's an F sharp, half diminished, F sharp minor 7, flat 5 if you like, chord near the end of the B section. I always made sure to really hit that F sharp, probably too much. Now I know a lot of things in here are far from perfect. You'll notice various spots where my fingers don't line up with the notes you're hearing. Punch-in saves the day, at least on the audio tracks. On the second to last day of recording, I spent a couple of fruitless hours struggling to record an electric piano solo that I ended up scrapping entirely, coming to question the entire project while I was at it. I'm learning to live with my inadequacies, while continuing to strive to grow and improve. And also to lean on my technical skills to compensate for my musical shortcomings. So yeah, that does mean splicing multiple takes, quantizing some stuff, cleaning up stray notes and MIDI tracks, etc. Is that cheating? Maybe, but I can't play all of these instruments at once, so multi-track is cheating anyway. Now we're about to get into the tricky stuff. On the original, this highly rhythmic section is played primarily on a marimba, but I drew inspiration from Bob Curno's big band arrangement, which splits it up amongst the sax section doubling on clarinets. It's not easy, especially when the rhythms the different instruments are playing don't line up. I realized as I got into it that I was going to need to simplify some of the parts, especially the third clarinet. Oh, and I had to record them without listening to any of the other parts so I didn't get thrown off. Now, this bass feature coming up really surprised me when I went to learn it. It's just an arpeggio on an F major chord with an add 9 at the top. In the context of everything else going on, I didn't realize how simple it was. And come to think of it, that makes it a mu major chord. Check out my Black Cow Sun video for more about that. I think this is my favorite part of the song. It's It's an unexpected whirlwind that shakes everything up. The original is played mostly by Lyle Mays on keyboard, with brass instrument samples, so I took the same approach on the EWI. I have to pause now. Alright, so this section, another nod to Lyle. I played half the rising lead in this final crescendo on an EWI synth patch that is clearly intended to replicate his signature sound. It's even called MG Mod Lyle. This was another part that surprised me with how hard it was to play, so I decided on the fly to split it up with a bit of Hocket, giving half of each measure to the soprano sax, which was originally going to play it all, and the other half to the Lyle synth. Now you may also notice if you're watching closely that I totally fluffed the notes on the EWI part. That's something about the EWI USB. Since it generates MIDI data, not actual audio, it ends up being tantalizingly easy to just stumble your way through a complicated passage and then clean it up after the fact. I did still try to play the right notes, but it was the last day of recording and I needed to wrap things up. So let's just say my computer keyboard was roughly as responsible for the end result as the EWI was. But I've only owned the EWI for a couple weeks at this point, so hopefully I'll improve. Anyway, back to the music. Now we're in the home stretch, the triumphant return of the main melody. I can't believe I made it this far. There are a lot of challenges in producing this recording and the video. Practical issues with the much delayed acquisition of the EWI, musical challenges as I worked harder than I usually bother to in learning some very complicated parts, but I also made some compromises and rewrote some to make them easier to play, just so I could get the damn thing done. And there were a lot of technical challenges, mainly around storage capacity. In the end, the video project file was nearly 200 gigabytes, and I almost lost big chunks of the data a few times. Finally, there was one weird audio glitch I never could resolve with the drum part under the clarinet choir section right where I switched from hi-hat to snare. The first beat or two of the snare track consistently drops out when I bounce the file from Logic, even with the most extreme quality settings. Maybe I'll figure it out before I finish the mix for the album. Yes, there's an album coming. For this video, I just decided to live with it. So why am I even doing this? Is anyone listening? Yeah, I'm wondering that right now too. So if you did happen to make it this far, congratulations. You're witnessing a personal breakdown, or maybe not. Because even though I almost gave up on this project in the proverbial 11th hour, the next day I came back and remembered that ultimately I was doing this for myself. For the joy and fulfillment and meaning I get from making music, regardless of who's listening or not listening, as the case may be. Again, if you made it this far, congratulations. I hope I've inspired you to dive deep into a project that means something to you and to create just because you can. And as promised, a bit more about the space I'm in, the padded room. It's not really a room at all. Eventually, I'd like to finish off a proper music studio space in my basement, but for now, I literally just have 4 padded moving blankets, $25 each, suspended from the rafters, with a 5th across the top as a ceiling of sorts, and a hodgepodge assortment of rugs on the floor, creating a 25 square foot space for music making. It's not soundproof, not even close. It is literally right next to our furnace, and it's February. But the funny thing about this setup is, it works. The furnace was actually blasting away as I recorded a few of the mic'd instrument parts, and this commentary track, but you'd never know it from the final mix. Noise gates are your friend. That's probably the biggest thing I want to convey about this space. Nothing about it should work as a recording studio, but it does. The point is, don't put off your creative work just because you don't have the right environment or the right tools or whatever else you think you need. Just go for it. Thanks for listening.